we don't do people pleasing for the sake of people pleasing. We do people pleasing for the sake of what we think we're going to get because of it. Do we get safety? Do we get accepted? Do we get included? Do we get chosen? And the fear of losing that is what can keep us stuck in this. And one of the indications can be that we struggle to say no to people for fear of what their reaction is going to be. Or we don't typically name a boundary with someone because we don't want to deal with their reaction. And like you said just a moment ago, it's about managing the outcome by limiting our reaction or our response.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host, and we are here today with Greg Miller, our usual host, full of his knowledge and experience. And again, we have Jim Farm, the clinical director here at Faithful and True, and we coerced him to staying with us to do another podcast. Jim, welcome.
Yeah,
happy to have you. And today we have another really interesting subject matter to discuss, and that is the subject of people pleasing.
Yeah. I was, looking at Galatians where Paul talks about, am I looking for, the approval of man or the approval of God? And so I thought that fits right into this concept that we run into quite a bit at the center in terms of people pleasing.
Yeah, we often talk about, from a clinical perspective, we may talk about enmeshment or codependency, but it really is this idea of orienting our life towards other people's acceptance or approvals or reactions in order for us to be able to create safety. And one of the things that we want to start off with is we have no judgment or shame if you find that this is something that you struggle with. I can absolutely say it's a part of my history and story. It's a pattern that I can fall back to. And really the idea is, it's a belief that I can only be safe if the other people in my life around me are happy or content or satisfied. And we learn this early as a child. And it really is a difficult, I think, pattern to break that's going to take a lot of encouragement and support.
Yeah. And that's a reality, actually, for a lot of children. Is they do need the people around them to be happy for them to feel safe.
And that's a great way to start is, what was true for us as children may no longer be true now, and it was true for us as children. The part of the nature of childhood is we are dependent upon the people who are in our lives. And the more we're given a message that, if dad's not happy or if mom's not happy, we're not safe, then the more we're going to fall into this pattern of doing whatever we have to do to create safety.
Yeah. One of the things I often talk about, when I talk about people pleasing is what are we actually after? What are we recovering? And so one of the things I talk about is, in that childhood learning is I have to limit vulnerability in order to manage the outcome of the relationship. And so what we're actually recovering is the ability to risk vulnerability and let go of the outcome.
Right.
And so, but that requires safety, like you said, for that to happen.
Well, and if I grew up in a home where my opinion wasn't valued, my voice wasn't encouraged, then it makes perfect sense. As an adult, I have some of those same beliefs that my voice doesn't matter, or if I have an opinion and it's different from somebody else, there's going to be a negative reaction. And as a child, that could absolutely have been true.
Yeah. And so we learn these strategies. I mean, they sometimes will, kids will over-apologize, or adults for that matter, over-apologize or over-explain. I'll never forget, this is a true story. I don't know if you remember this, Greg. It was probably like 4 years ago. And I don't remember what it was. I think I had an idea for the workshop. And it was like a Monday. And I text you, like, Greg, can you meet Thursday at noon? And you text back and you're like, I got a full day on Thursday and I need a break at lunch or something like that. And I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, Greg, but it's a good idea. But you were able to just say no, and I'm assuming you had no idea if it was going to upset me or not. But
right.
It was,
Right. And well, in part, what's interesting is part of being healthy is naming our limits. Yeah. And if you grew up in an environment where your limits weren't honored, where you weren't allowed to have limits or name your no, then it makes sense years later you were afraid of that. And I like what you said. We don't do people pleasing for the sake of people pleasing. We do people pleasing for the sake of what we think we're going to get because of it. Do we get safety? Do we get accepted? Do we get included? Do we get chosen? And the fear of losing that is what can keep us stuck in this. And one of the indications can be that we struggle to say no to people for fear of what their reaction is going to be, or we don't typically name a boundary with someone because we don't want to deal with their reaction. And like you said just a moment ago, it's about managing the outcome by limiting our reaction or our response.
Yeah. It's a huge thing because there is a fear that leads into that behavior.
Right.
And oftentimes based on a true reality of something that's happened. I shared and I got rejected, or I shared and got abandoned. And so paying attention to those emotions that are coming up as I'm wanting to risk vulnerability. I've heard clients say, I know what I want to say, I just can't get it to come out.
Right. Well, and a lot of times what we end up doing is we have the conversations in our head that we're not comfortable having with somebody else. And so we're playing it over and over. This is what I'd like to say, or, but it, like you said, it's difficult to get it from our head to our voice and actually speak it out loud.
Yeah. The courage to be able to do that. And that's where, we talk about, finding safe places where we can risk the vulnerability, and
that's why community is so important. There are certain relationships that it feels like there's so much at stake, or we're so afraid of somebody's reaction. The thought of having a no there, or naming a boundary there, or having an opinion there just feels so intimidating at the beginning. But if we have this safe community and we know that these people are for us, then that gives us a place to practice having our voice in relationship and knowing that, okay, somebody may have a reaction to this, but that is survivable. That, one of our fear is if somebody's angry at me, they will leave me. Yeah. And so we're going to do everything we can to make sure that somebody's not angry with me or disappointed in me. But if we actually have some experiences where somebody is angry at me or disappointed in me and they're still in relationship with me, that begins to create a new association. And, we know neurons that fire together wire together. And the way that we begin to change that is create these new associations.
Yeah. It was interesting. I had a group one time where one of the guys had said, he comes from a different political orientation than what he believed the other guys did in the group. And so he was fearful that if you brought that up in group, they would kind of turn against him. And I said, I don't know if they will or not, to be quite honest with you, but I'll be there, you know. And so I encouraged him to do it. And surprisingly, even to a certain degree for myself, I was surprised by how the other guys, even though they came from a different space, they didn't reject him.
Right. Well, and the sign of a healthy relationship is that we can be in relationship with people who don't agree with us, that we have the capacity to stay engaged. Beth and I often use the imagery of the table. We have the capacity to stay at the table with people who aren't necessarily in agreement with everything that we believe or say. And what happens, though, is if we don't have the capacity to stay at the table with people who disagree with us, we're constantly looking for the table where everybody agrees with us in order to create safety. Yeah. And the reality is, in families, not everybody's going to agree. In communities, not everybody's going to agree. In churches, not everybody's going to agree. So if we don't have the skill to stay engaged, to have our voice, one of the ways that we can know we're not using our voice is if we carry a lot of resentment. If I have a lot of resentment, typically that's a good indication that I have anger and I have grief that have not been expressed. And the thing about the anger is there's probably something that I'm angry about that I didn't use my voice for, and I accommodated somebody, I placated somebody. But what can also be true is I have grief because I didn't use my voice. I didn't speak about something that was important to me. And so this people-pleasing shows up in a variety of different ways. And I think the way that God presents it is recognizing that it is a choice of, am I going to be focused on people-pleasing and allow the people's reactions and their responses to me define me? Or am I going to seek to be in relationship with God in such a way that I trust God's truth to define me? We often talk about, God's truth, the truth of who we are, the truth of who God is. And that truth is what sets us free. And we're not going to do this perfectly. We live in communities. We want to be accepted. Somebody will say to me, well, I don't care what anybody thinks. Well, what I know is that's not healthy either, and that more than likely isn't true. The alternative is I do care what people think, and I'm not going to let myself be defined by their opinion of me.
Yeah.
Well, for the alternative, I let God's truth be what defines me. I orient towards God's truth. So even if I've had experiences where I believe I'm worthless because of the way that somebody treated me or their reaction to me, I can live in my truth. I have infinite worth because of God. God is the one who gives me a worth. If I have a core belief because of the experiences I've had that I don't matter, I get regrounded in the truth that because of who God is and what God says, I matter, because that is the identity that God has given me.
Yeah, I think so. It's, sometimes when we grow up in those early environments, we're looking for that external validation of our, of who we are. And part of that is, it's a calling once again to, what you said is finding our internal value based on how God created us.
Right.
But, even if we do get the external valuation, if we haven't worked on that part of ourselves, we won't receive it anyways.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of like it just pours through us. We're not able to retain it. And, one of the things that, again, I want to just say, all of this makes sense. Part of the thing that a child has to learn is what is known as the differentiated self, where the child is able to separate him or herself from their environment or from people's reactions or from others. And until we learn that, we are defined by people's reactions. So if someone is critical of us, we take that in as who we are. If we are alone in our environment, we take that in as an understanding of our identity. And it takes some very intentional work to separate ourselves out so that I can know I am not somebody else's reaction. I am not my environment. I'm not somebody's opinion of me. I'm not somebody's judgment of me, but it's going to take some intentionality to really kind of reorient towards the greater truth of my value, identity, and safety come from who God is and who God says I am.
And I think one of the hard parts about this is, when someone does respond authentically, they are going to get the disappointment. They are going to get the angry response,
Right.
And that's hard.
Yeah. Like the example that you gave, you said to the guy, I don't know how they're going to respond. It could have just as easily gone negative, depending on where the men were in that moment, what was going on for them. Good guys don't always respond well. And so it's important that that guy knew, even if they respond poorly, even if they do judge me, even if they do exclude me, I continue to be safe because my safety doesn't ultimately come from this group. I want to be in the group. I want to be a part of the community, but I have to have a sense of safety that transcends my circumstances, that safety that comes from the truth of who God is. So I go into it not with, an absolute certainty that this is going to go well. In fact, one of the things I will often say to people is before you have that conversation, you need to have a certain amount of confidence that you can be okay, meaning you can be safe if this does not go well. But if you can only be safe if it goes well, you're kind of limiting your ability to move past this if it doesn't. So let's work on you strengthening your truth so that even if it doesn't go well, you know that ultimately you're going to be safe.
Yeah. I'm thinking of our colleague, Elizabeth Griffin, who often says, if you're not creating anger in somebody every so often, you're probably not being authentic.
Right. Well, I tell this story. It was early in my ministry. I was on staff at a church. Beth and I were newly married, and one of the leaders of the church, one of the deacons, came to me and said, he and his wife had been married for 40 years or something like that, and we had never had a fight. And Beth and I were young and naive, and we knew somebody's not showing up in that relationship. Yeah. If you're in a relationship and nobody has been hurt, nobody has gotten angry, there's not been a fight, somebody's not showing up with their truth, because that's just the reality. And I can say I grew up in a home where we avoided conflict. I have very few memories of there being this kind of confrontational energy in my family. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't the energy of disagreement or, there wasn't tension in the house. It's just that it wasn't confrontational. And so when I got married and was in other relationships, I really didn't even know how to do that. And I feared it because it was so unfamiliar. So, I was having a conversation with someone, and we were talking about kind of arguing in front of the kids. And I said, one of the best gifts you can give your children is for them to see you argue with each other and also see what does the path of reconciliation look like. If they're going to see you arguing, they need to see you owning. They need to see you taking responsibility. They need to see you apologizing. And they need to see you doing things differently in the future. But if all they see is silence and no arguments, or all they see are arguments that are never resolved, they're going to end up with a pretty distorted view of what a functioning relationship is going to look like.
Yeah, that's very good. I think that's very true. So some of these things that are hard is, being able to say no to people. I was talking to Debbie not too long ago, and they said, no is a complete sentence. It can just be a no period.
Right.
You don't have to explain it away.
Now, the English teacher in me says, no, that's not true. And I'm not an English teacher. My mother was one. But I think you're right. No can be enough, And what's interesting is it doesn't have to be an exclamation point.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be an angry no. It doesn't have to be an energized no. It can be no with a period. It's just no. I'm not able to do that. And I do, one of the ways that we talk about addiction here, addiction is not having our yes and having our no. That, in that moment of choosing where I'm drawn towards the drug, where I want to act out, what's missing is my ability to say no to that. Yeah. So I don't have a no to the things that are robbing me of life, and I don't have a yes to the things that bring me life. Yeah. And what I believe is if I don't have a no, then I don't have a yes. And if I don't have a yes, I don't have a no. Yeah. And so recovery is foundational on I'm finding my no, I'm stewarding my no, and I'm using my no. And I'm not always going to do it perfectly. If I'm learning a new skill, I'm going to be stumbly. I may use my no more often, or I may actually need my no more often and I don't have it as often. But I'm going to learn in my recovery how to be a good steward of my yes and how to be a good steward of my no. And when my yes is yes and my no is no, there's going to be a lot less resentment and bitterness on my part.
Yeah. And we have to give our kids the ability to be able to say no.
Oh, absolutely.
You'll like this story, Greg. So my middle son, he was just a little tyke, Ethan, Ethan.
Yes.
And we were eating dinner one night, and so we're about ready to do the dishes. And, the rule was the boys could, bring the dishes into the sink or whatever. And Ethan just got up and left his plate at the kitchen table. And I'm like, Ethan, you have to bring your plate into the sink or whatever. He says, no. Just a little guy. I'm like, well, that's fine, but usually if you're at a restaurant, you have to leave a tip if somebody's going to pick your dishes up. So he gets up from the table, walks upstairs to his piggy bank, comes down with a dollar bill, pops it on the table.
There you go.
There was a solution.
It was a solution, but he got to be able to say no.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
and what's interesting is as parents, a lot of times we fear our kids no because we're the first people that they say no to. And what we end up doing unintentionally is we take our child's no away. But there's going to be times where they have other people in their life that they desperately need that no for. And if we take their no away as parents, then they don't have it. Now, it's complicated. If you have kids, there are things that are dangerous that they need to be able to say no to. We do create boundaries and guidelines and safety. But we also need to be very cautious not to give a blanket, take their no away because it's an inconvenience, to how do we help them understand no. And to understand there's, like you said, there's consequences to the no. You can use your no in this situation, but here's the consequence. So you can use your no and here's the consequence, or you can use your yes and here's the benefit. But I'm not taking it away from him. I'm giving that child more understanding of how to resource that no in a wise way.
Yeah, because he's going to need that no when he's an adolescent.
Absolutely. Well, and he probably is going to need that no even in elementary school. That's when he has opportunities outside of the family system and he's invited to do something that intuitively he knows he's not supposed to do. But if I too much of a people pleaser, I'm going to say yes. I can't tell you the number of stories I've heard here at Faithful and True of men who created all kinds of chaos simply because they went along with, they didn't want to do it. They intuitively knew it wasn't right. And yet they didn't have their no in that moment, and they went along with it. It was that people pleasing. They were afraid of somebody's reaction. They were afraid of being excluded later, and they didn't have a strong enough sense of self just to stay, solid in their no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that approval that was on the line for them that they didn't want to risk.
Right. One of the things I've heard is a parent tell their child, if you don't have a no, then use my no. Mm-hmm. So if somebody says, hey, let's go do this, and you know that intuitively it's not safe
wrong.
and wise, then all you have to do is say, no, I can't do that. My dad told me not to do that. Or my dad is coming to pick me up. Or it's while your child is learning to know, then let him resource the parent's no to begin to create safety. But he still has a no. May not be his, but it can be his parents.
Yeah, yeah. It takes a lot of flexibility as a parent, though, to be able to, obviously.
It does. And we don't always do it well, but we seek to do it well.
Yeah. And if we mess it up, we can repair. It's
right.
like what you talked about before. It's the apology, the humility to be able to apologize to your kids when you don't do it well.
Right. I know we're getting ready to conclude. I just want to say, I hope our conversation has been helpful and clarifying and not a place of shame. Mm-hmm. Shame is not going to serve us. We all struggle with these things. We all have those relationships that are most complex. And what can be true is I may have my no and my boundaries in a lot of relationships, but there may be a couple of relationships because of the intensity of them or the history of them or the chaos of them. It's like when I get in that place, it's like I can't even find my no. So I want us all to know this is a work in progress. We're all working to have our voice and to align ourselves with the truth of God versus orienting ourselves towards the pleasure of or approval of men.
Yeah. These things are really hard to change because they're really rooted in some survival mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So they're just difficult to change. So having that self-compassion when it doesn't go the way you had hoped it would.
Right. And we often say recovery is not about fixing a problem or solving an issue. Recovery is about healing a wound. And when I struggle with this enmeshment or codependency or this seeking the approval of people, it's important that I ask myself, what is the wound that is driving this? And how can I begin to experience God's healing in that wound?
All right. Well, Jim, thanks for joining us again today.
Yes.
Another great topic and great conversation. Made me remember that we always told our two boys that if it gets you out of a hard situation, put it on us as your parent. My mom or dad wouldn't want me to do this. Mm-hmm. The answer is no. And then if they go to get disturbed by it, just say, hey, give me credit for it. And, we'll take it from there. And that always seemed to work in a very positive way. Yeah. So, we'd like to thank you for joining us today and hope that today's discussion has been a benefit to you as well. We invite you to take a look at the Faithful and True website where we have over 550 podcasts such as this one that hopefully will be helpful to you on your healing journey. We hope that you'll take a look at the website and see all the information and online registration for our Men's Journey Workshop, for our Women's Journey Workshop, and for our two various couples journey workshops that are available to you. In the meantime, we hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.